Perfect, perfect. Right on. Yeah, it looks like people are really starting to roll in now, which is good. And while everyone's rolling in, thank you again, Clement. Thank you, Wines of Rioja. Thank you, European Union. Thank you, Megha, for
It sounded
for
like an
a
Oscar speech.
I'll get my thank yous in right now just for making this happen. It's always nice to get the nation sommeliers together, right? And with technology, it's so awesome that you can spread knowledge throughout without being in person. Okay. Yeah, we're just about halfway. They're still rolling in. I don't know if you want to get started, Megha. But thank you again. Welcome. For those that are in the chat, if you can mute yourself if you're not already. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put your Zoom hand up. I will let Megha know that there's a question, and then we will prompt you to ask your question. So we'll give the floor to you, and yeah, everyone enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Domer. Well, good
Thank you.
morning or afternoon, depending on wherever you are today. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the seminar on Rioja Blanco. It's a category that I think is often overlooked, but I think it's sort of having a moment now. We're seeing a resurgence of this style of wine. And so I'm really excited to be able to dive more deeply into it with all of you. So thank you, Rioja DOCA, for organizing this, and for CAPS Canada, and for all the other chapters that have helped to spread the word and whose members are joining us today. I really appreciate all of you being here. As Domer mentioned, just some housekeeping. Please feel free to ask questions during the course of the presentation. I think it'll make the discussion more lively and it'll enrich our conversation if you have something you want to add, or if you have a question or you want some sort of clarification. You can use the hand raising function in case you weren't sure when Domer mentioned it. And then he will help moderate the questions. He'll try to get my attention, and I'll try to answer them as well and as quickly as I can. Also, if you have chosen wines to accompany the seminar, please feel free to taste them whenever you like. I'm going to discuss them, at least the wines that I've chosen, towards the end of the session, and I'd welcome your comments at that point. But please feel free to sip on them or taste them whenever during the course of the discussion. With that, I'm going to say cheers. I'm going to take a little sip of my first wine. That is delicious. All right, let's get started. Sorry, so here's a little bit about me. This is sort of a little background of how I came to my career in wine. I'm currently a critic at Wine and Line, and I also write about food and wine, especially at Good Food Revolution, and I'm a Rioja certified educator since November 2022. All right, I'm going to jump right in. I'll start off with giving you a more general overview of the history, geology, topography, that sort of thing of the Rioja region. The idea is that we're probably all familiar with this, so I'm going to be pretty quick and brief, but it's helpful to kind of have it in the back of our minds as a context as we dive more deeply into talking about Rioja Blanco. I'd especially like for us to keep three things in mind, or three factors that I believe contribute to the diversity of Rioja wine. First is its the multiplicity of terroirs in Rioja as a result of its complex topography. We're going to dive into that a little bit more. The second is the wide range of grape varieties that are in use in this region. And thirdly, it is the sort of very rich heritage of vinification techniques and winemaking and wine growing techniques that are a result of Rioja's long and storied history. So let's just start off by talking about Rioja's history. We're probably all quite familiar with how it all began. You had the Phoenicians. Sorry, I'm just trying to move all of you over to the right so I can see the screen, see my slide. You had the Phoenicians who first came to the region, and they brought winemaking know-how by way of the river Ebro. Then you had the Romans coming in. They planted more vineyards. They brought more winemaking know-how. And then you had the Moorish occupation of Iberia, where during this time, winemaking was tolerated, but not exactly encouraged. So there was a little bit of a lull. But then once there was the Christian reconquest of the region towards the end of the 15th century, you again saw winemaking and wine growing really flourish in the region. You saw monks producing wine in vineyards surrounding the many, many monasteries that were built along St. James Way. If you're not familiar, that is the route that pilgrims would take to go visit the shrine of the apostle St. James. So this led to a great amount of great increase in the number of vineyards being planted in the wineries that were established. This was also the period when you saw the first regulations coming into place that were to safeguard the reputation of wines from Rioja. There were also three pioneers who played an important role in the history of Rioja. First, you had Don Manuel Quintano. You probably have heard of him. He was a monk. He went to Bordeaux to study, but he was also interested in wine. So he began to study winemaking there and brought back some of that knowledge. And then in the early 19th century, you had Marqués de Riscal and Marqués de Murrieta, who were actually in exile because there were some civil wars happening over the throne, the Spanish crown, the control for the Spanish crown. And so they actually learned a lot when they were in Bordeaux as well, because they were very interested in winemaking. And so they brought back a lot of this winemaking know-how, including things like destemming and techniques like barrel aging. Then, of course, there were two vine diseases that had a profound impact on how winemaking evolved in this region. The first people are less familiar with. This was in the 1840s. You had powdery mildew attack vineyards in Bordeaux. So you started to have producers and winemakers coming into Rioja looking for wine. And then subsequently, you have the more famous phylloxera epidemic, which happened in 1860s, at least in Bordeaux. And so you had producers coming to Rioja looking to buy grapes or to buy wine. And of course, this had a profound influence because now suddenly you had producers in Rioja looking to satisfy that demand. And therefore, they were deeply influenced by the French techniques, the Bordeaux techniques rather, of winemaking and wine growing. This was sort of a watershed moment in Rioja's history. There was a train station that was built in Aro. I'm sure many of you have already visited. It's an absolutely fantastic place to visit if you haven't been. And not only did this train station's establishment facilitate transporting grapes from Aro to Bordeaux, but it also led to the development of many wineries around the station that still exist to this day. There are iconic wineries that I'm sure we're all aware of, like Cune and La Rioja Alta and Bodegas Francos Españolas. So, and they're all also quite heavily influenced by these French techniques of winemaking that came in through Bordeaux. So, as I said, this was a very important moment in Rioja's history, and winemaking really flourished during this period. But unfortunately, subsequently, you had phylloxera coming to Rioja as well, and this was followed by several other events, including a civil war, the dictatorship in Spain, and the Second World War, which meant that winemaking kind of didn't do very well at this time, and it sort of had a setback. But then from the 1970s onwards, you see it picking up again. And now, of course, today you have Rioja where it is. I should note in 1925, it was the first DO in Spain. And then in 1991, it became a DOCA, one of only two in all of Spain. Other than Priorat, it's only Rioja. So this is just a sort of overview of the history, but we're going to dive a little bit more into the history when we start to talk about Rioja whites. Keep in mind what I said about the influence of Bordeaux on this region, because I think that's going to be something we're going to revisit in greater detail later. Now let's talk a little bit about the location. I'm sure we all know where it is. It's in north central Spain. This map does a great job of showing us exactly where it is. So it's a pretty long region. It's about 100 kilometers long, but it's only 40 kilometers wide. And it covers three autonomous regions, La Rioja, Navarra, and País Vasco. It has a very interesting topography. So I'm going to show you a map that does a pretty good job of highlighting it. So you can see that there's a complex topography here. In the north, you have Sierra de Cantabria, a mountain range that protects the region from the cold, wet weather coming in from the Atlantic. In the south, you have Sierra de la Demanda and Sierra de Cameros, two different mountain ranges that protect the region from the hotter weather coming in from central Spain. Then you can see the River Ebro going from the northwest to the southeast. It has also 7 tributaries that edge valleys of their own through the region, and they create their own terroirs and microclimates. What's also interesting about the river Ebro is that it's wider as it flows southeast. So although Rioja is fairly far from the Mediterranean coast, the valley brings in a Mediterranean influence because of the shape of the valley. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. There are 3 different soil types. I'm not going to go really deeply into it, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So you have clay limestone soils that are prevalent in Rioja Alavesa as well as in Rioja Alta. So these are poor in organic content, not very fertile, rich in lime, and they're difficult soils to cultivate, and they drain with difficulty. Then you have ferrous clay, which is mostly in Rioja Alta and Rioja Oriental. Because of the clay content, it's a bit cooler. These types of soils dominate in the many hills, the middle hills, and in the high areas, and in alluvial terraces that you have in these 2 regions, Rioja Alta and Rioja Oriental. And then you have the last type of soil, which is alluvial soils, which you find on the banks of the River Ebro and of the banks of all these tributaries. It's sandy, it's stony, it allows for deeper root penetration, there's good drainage, and it reflects sunlight and stays warm, so it can help with keeping the heat in the soil and helping the vines ripen. All right, let's talk a little bit about the zones. As we all know, there's 3 zones. You have Rioja Alta, which is mostly to the south of the River Ebro, though there's a small portion that exists to the north. It's a continental climate with quite a strong Atlantic influence, so it's cooler and wetter generally than the other regions. Then you have Rioja Alavesa. There's a similar climate to Rioja Alta, but it has less of a maritime influence because it's better protected because of the mountain range. Then you have Rioja Oriental, which is a bit of a warmer and drier region because of that Mediterranean influence that I just talked about, because of how the river valley is shaped. So that gives a lot of diversity to the region, but I should add a caveat that even within these zones, there's a great deal of diversity. And in fact, to really talk about these regions in such broad generalizations is something that can be helpful in a discussion such as this, but actually there's a lot more going on even within these zones. There's sub regions, so to speak, and complex terroir differences. Okay, with that, let's talk about the grape varieties. So as we know, Rioja is mostly known for its red wines and its darker grape varieties. It accounts for 91% of the vineyards that are planted to vine. But white wine plantings are growing as of now. Well, these statistics are from 2022, I believe. White grapes account for 9% of the vineyards that are planted to vine. And of course, Viura is first among them. It's also known as Macabeo. It's a thick-skinned variety. It's late budding, late ripening, susceptible to botrytis bunch rot. It can be slightly finicky and a difficult variety to grow, and it's best suited to warm, dry climates. But what's interesting about it is that it's quite versatile, so you can make very different styles of wine with it. When it's grown at high yields and you want to make it in a fresher style with less aging and maybe just a little bit of time in stainless steel and fermentation in stainless steel, it's going to make fruit forward, refreshing, light, very enjoyable, but not so complex wines. On the other hand, if you were to grow it with lower yields, with long barrel and bottle aging, then you can get much more complex wines with interesting texture, with lots of nutty flavors, with some honeyed notes, with some almonds, that sort of stuff, maybe even some brioche notes. It ages very well because it's quite resistant to oxidation. It also, one thing that's important to know is it often forms the major component of white variety blends from Rioja. Okay. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about Tempranillo Blanco. This was discovered relatively recently. I think the story of its discovery is kind of a very interesting anecdote. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but in 1988, there was a winemaker just working in his vineyard in a village in La Rioja, and he came across this cluster of greenish yellow grapes, and he thought, hey, what is this? Because it was a vineyard of Tempranillo, as in Tempranillo Tinto. And so he didn't understand what these grapes were doing in the vineyard. So he took a sample, tested it, and sure enough, it turned out to be a mutation of Tempranillo Tinto. And so the Consejo, that is the Rioja DOCA, basically tested it. They had a little plot that they grew it in, and they decided that it had potential. And so it was approved as a permitted variety to be grown in Rioja in 2007. It has great acidity. It has high levels of malic acid. It can be crunchy and crisp and very juicy and refreshing. It has lots of fruity flavors, tropical fruit, orchard fruit, citrus fruit, that sort of stuff. A little bit floral notes. So quite an interesting, refreshing wine that I think really meets what is currently quite fashionable and people really enjoy drinking. So a lot of potential there. It also gives good yield, so it's quite popular amongst wine growers in the flatlands that are irrigated and mechanized in Rioja Oriental. And I think it's slowly, you're going to see more and more of it in the market. At least I hope so. So other than this, there are 7 other varieties because there are 9 total varieties that are permitted. There's Verdejo, which of course, at least DNA testing has shown that it's from Rueda. But that's having said that, there's evidence to suggest that it's been in Rioja for at least a century. In fact, during phylloxera, when so many vines died, wine growers experimented and tried planting many different types of varieties to see what would work, and Verdejo was one of them. So it's been around for a while, actually, in Rioja. Garnacha Blanca is a historic Rioja variety. It's been there for a long time. And it makes, more, it's a productive, vigorous grape variety, and it makes full-bodied, high-alcohol wines that can be quite oxidative in style. Then you have Sauvignon Blanc, which is, of course, an international variety, so we're all familiar with it, as well as Chardonnay. Then we have Malvasia de Rioja. Interestingly, this was what was the more popular or common white grape that was grown before Viura came into fashion. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on when we talk about styles of white wines and how they've evolved. What's interesting about this is that it makes very rich alcoholic dry wines with a lot of depth. It can make wines with a lot of intense secondary and tertiary characteristics as well. So it can be quite interesting, and it can respond well to oak aging as well. Maturana Blanca is another variety that was introduced along with Tempranillo Blanco in 2007. And then you have Torrontés de Rioja, which is not to be confused with Torrontés from either Galicia or Argentina. It's a totally different variety. It makes fruit-forward, light wines with a medium finish. All right. So now we get to jump into what I find particularly interesting, which is the history of white wine in Rioja. So very interestingly, white wine has been popular in Spain for a longer time than red has. Even in as early as the 17th century, you had Spanish wines mostly being white. In fact, in Aro in 1689, when they were measuring the amount of wine being made, they found that 36,000 cántaras, excuse my pronunciation if I'm not saying it correctly, that's a type of 16-liter jar. They found that 36,000 cántaras of white wines were made, whereas only 6,000 of red were being made at that time. So this only began to change during the 19th century. So I'm going to, kind of have you revisit that discussion we had about what happened when there was the phylloxera hit Bordeaux and there was an influence of Bordeaux in Rioja. This led to the shift to reds because when winemakers and wine growers saw that there was this enormous demand for red wine from Bordeaux producers, they started to then plant red varieties more and make red wine more. Even then, though, they would often blend reds with whites to add acidity. They would make clarets or rosé. It was only very, very slowly that red wine became more popular and started to take over. You started to see a continuing decrease in planting of white varieties after the Spanish Civil War. And over the decades afterwards. That said, there were several producers who were still sticking with tradition and making iconic traditional white Rioja that was barrel aged for a long time. For instance, you had Cune's Monopole, which was trademarked in 1915. I believe it is still made to this day. You also had Bodegas Franco Españolas making their sweet Diamante wine. And then there was a famous sparkling wine called Lumen that was made by Bodegas Bilbañas, which if I'm not mistaken, is still available today. So there were still some whites that were in the market, but that said, generally speaking, the popularity of white varieties was falling and red wine was becoming more and more common. So what happened in the modern era? This is less of a linear story than what we were talking about earlier. First, you started to see a shift away from Malvasia de Rioja and Garnacha Blanca, which was grown more before. In the 1960s, you started to see a move towards using more and more Viura. The 1990s, you saw that Viura's plantations were starting to get older. So these older wines were producing more high quality fruit and therefore better quality wine. So you started to see a little bit better wine being produced. In the 2000s, you started to see a shift in focus towards native varieties and the development of Tempranillo Blanco. But what's also interesting is that in 2010, of course, there was the international varieties that were introduced, and that was in 2017. But what's interesting is that by the 1990s, you started to see white varieties almost disappearing, but this totally changed. There was a reversal in this. And now in the last 20 years, you're seeing the amount of white varieties being planted has almost, the amount of hectares planted to white varieties has almost doubled in the last 2 decades. So that's pretty amazing. And you're really seeing that trend is an upward trend. We can theorize as to why this is. In my view, in part, it's probably due to consumer preference. You're seeing a lot of demand for lighter whites. Another reason is perhaps climate change. And thirdly, it could be that there are some really interesting producers doing some very interesting things with white wines, which is increasing the demand for them because people are starting to become interested in what they're doing. We're going to talk a little bit and showcase some of these producers shortly. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the style of white wine and how it's evolved. So it's a little bit of history again, but this time we're talking about style. So through most of the early 19th century until about the 80s, the focus was, as I was saying, on these long barrel-aged, bottle-aged white Riojas. You had, like I said, the Cune monopole, but you also had Lopez de Heredia making their Gran Reserva Blanco. You had Castillo Ige Blanco. So this was the style that was prevalent. But there was, like I mentioned, a shift away from Malvasia de Rioja to Viura, but Viura was still being oak barrel-aged and then bottle-aged for a long time. It's a rather subtle variety and does not oxidize much, so it's actually quite suitable for this style of winemaking. But in the 80s, you started to see a decline in this approach because there was less of a demand for this style of wine. This coincided with the introduction of temperature-controlled vinification in Rioja. Marques de Cáceres was leading in this. So what you started to see is these lighter, fresher reds. They were crisp. They were meant to be drunk in the first year of their production. They weren't meant to be aged. And overall, all across Spain, this became the fashion. This is what consumers wanted to drink. So you definitely saw a move away from that barrel-aged style, despite the fact that there were still some producers who were sticking to that traditional vinification style and making some oak-aged whites. And I will say that even Marques de Murrieta stopped making their iconic Gran Reserva Blanco for a time because consumers were actually bringing it back to the store saying, hey, this wine is faulty, it's oxidized. So basically, it had kind of fallen out of fashion. Okay. So then what happened from the 1990s? Well, as it happens with fashion, with music, all of that, sometimes everything old becomes new again. And suddenly barrel aging was cool again. You started seeing a lot of winemakers move back towards experimenting with different styles of aging, not necessarily just in new oak barrels, trying some old, trying not just American, but French, different types of vessels, different shapes. Also aging on lees. You started to see also some more Burgundy style Chardonnay, Burgundy Chardonnay style Viura being made. But what's interesting is that you also saw a third category that was a midway path between those fresh, light, somewhat simple whites and these long oak and barrel and bottle aged whites. Somewhere in between was this third category that had begun to emerge of high quality wines that were that were quite diverse because you had producers trying very different styles. The one thing that they had in common, though, was that they were focusing on viticulture. Arguably, this trend was jump-started by Telmo Rodriguez when he made his first white wine at Remayuri in 1994. It was a blend of 10 white varieties, and interestingly, there was no Viura featured in it. It was quite a hit at the time, and it's still an iconic wine. You also had Miguel Ángel de Gregoria from Finca Allende, who started making his Martires, which is an extraordinary monovarietal Viura from old vines. It debuted in 1995. So what this new style of winemaking represents, in my view, is a lot of creativity. You see a mix of tradition and innovation, and you see a lot of different winemakers trying new things, trying to basically bring out both the terroir of Rioja and its history. Here is a picture of Telmo Rodriguez's Remayuri high altitude white vine vineyard. It's quite beautiful. I think it's quite a scenic view as well. I don't know if any one of you have visited. You should visit if you can. Let's move on. So what does white Rioja look like today? So as I said, because you have that fresh, light, refreshing, crispy, fruity style. On the other hand, you have this rich barrel and bottle aged style. And now in the middle, you have this range of different varieties of different styles that exist on the spectrum between these two extremes. You have this huge diversity, this rich array of options to choose from. And not only this, there's a wide range of price points to choose from, ranging from very, very low, from like, probably around $15 to hundreds of dollars. So there's a diversification at all price points in terms of style and quality. You're also seeing white grape varieties being planted at higher altitudes as a way to combat climate change. You're also seeing a shift in focus onto native grape varieties. I think this is really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense because it combines some of the strengths of Rioja, that is its diversity, but also its typicity, because these native grape varieties are only in Rioja. So that's what's interesting about it, because you're seeing you have these 9 different varieties, 6 of which are only found in Rioja. So I think that that's a strength of the region, and it makes sense to lean into it. You're seeing that Tempranillo Blanco has a lot of potential. I think it still needs to be explored further, as I had mentioned. I think that we're going to hopefully see more and more examples of it and different styles, people trying different ways of fermenting it and aging it. Some producers have kept to their traditions, others have been innovative and reinvented themselves. And there's this new generation of winemakers, as I mentioned, who are breaking with tradition in some ways, but also returning to tradition in others. But I think thematically, the one thing that they all seem to have in common is that they're refocusing on the vineyard, on viticulture, making sure that they're growing the best quality fruit that express the terroir in the best possible way. Okay, let's just talk very quickly about the DOCA regulations, and then I promise we can jump into tasting some wine, because I know these topics can be a little dry. So I'm sure we're all familiar with this, but there are 9 authorized grape varieties, like I mentioned. Viura, Garnacha Blanca, and Malvasia were approved in 1925, right at the inception of the DO. 2007 was when Maturana Blanca, Tempranillo Blanco, and Turuntes were approved. And then in 2017, you had Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Verdejo approved. I should note that these 3 varieties cannot be a dominant proportion of any blend. So they can only amount to 49% of a blend. A native variety has to be the dominant variety in a blend. All right, I think we all know about the DOCA's very strict aging protocols, but for white wine, they're a little different than they are for red. So you have Generico, which has no minimum aging requirements at all. Then you have Crianza, wherein the wines have to be aged for 6 months' time in barrel. There's no minimum time in bottle prescribed for any of the categories of white wine. However, a Crianza must spend a minimum of 2 calendar years in the winery from October 1st of the harvest year before it can be released. Then you have Reservas, which again, 6 months time in barrel, 24 months in the winery. And then you have Grand Reservas, which must spend 6 months time in barrel, and then 48 months in the winery. Of course, as you are all probably aware, there's another classification system that was introduced by the DOCA, which is a terroir-based classification. This pyramid-shaped diagram, I think, does a good job of sort of explaining how it works. So the bottom of the pyramid, you have the Generico again. So these are basically wines that have no particular designation of origin other than the fact that they originate in Rioja. Then you have at the next level up, Vinos de Zona. These are basically wines where the grapes come from one of those 3 zones that we talked about. There is an allowance. 85% of the grapes must come from there. 15% can come from another zone. But otherwise, the wine must be produced, bottled, and aged within that zone in order to carry that zone's name on the label. The next level up is Vinos de Municipio. Here, the winery must be located within a particular municipality, and the grapes must come, 85% again of the grapes must come from the municipality. 15% can come from a neighboring municipality. For both the Vinos de Zona and Vinos de Municipio, there should be production traceability. So basically, you have to keep track in the winery of where all the grapes have been coming in from. Then at the top of the pyramid, you have Viñedos Singulares. These are single vineyard wines. not only do all the grapes have to come from a designated single vineyard, but the person applying for the classification has to show that the plot imparts certain unique characteristics to the grapes. Otherwise, it isn't necessarily deserving of this particular classification. Here, again, there's some higher standards for more stringent standards that must be met. The first is that the vines must be at least 35 years old. The yields have to be 20% lower than what is normally required by the DOCA, and all the grapes must be hand harvested. And again, there has to be production traceability. So now that we've gotten through some of the dry stuff, I think it's time to try tasting one of the wines. I know that everybody has different wines with them today, so I'm just going to talk through the wines that I have. Hopefully some of you have the same wines, and after that, I would love it if some of you could chime in and talk about the wines that you have chosen today. Maybe you can tell us if they're similar to the ones I picked, maybe they're a little different. I know that Clément Domer have some interesting wines that they have brought today as well, so I'd love to hear from them too. So the first one that I chose for today is it's made by a winemaker who's a great example of that new wave of winemakers that I talked about. It's the Sierra de Tolonio Blanco. The winemaker is Sandra Bravo. She has trained all over the world in Bordeaux, Chianti Classico, in Priorat, California, but then she came back to where she's from, which is Rioja, her homeland, to make wine there. What I find particularly interesting about her is all of her grapes are biodynamically produced, organically produced. She's very focused on promoting biodiversity in her vineyard. She speaks of it as if it's important, not just from a sustainability perspective, but because she believes that it imparts more complexity and character to the wines. And it's part of the terroir after all. So this particular wine was spontaneously fermented. It was aged for 6 months on lees, and only 10% of it saw some oak, just in used French oak barrels. So I think it's really just giving it a little bit of texture without imparting too much flavor, or in any way overshadowing the fruit. One other thing that I wanted to mention about her is that she says that a lot of people harvest Viura when the berries are golden, but that she feels, and to quote her, that the berries are basically dead at that point. So she's breaking with tradition and trying to pick them much earlier to preserve freshness and acidity in the wine, and I can really taste that. I can really taste that in the glass. There's just so much fresh pears and citrus fruit and apples. They're crunchy. It's almost like you're biting into these orchard fruits and you're tasting some juicy citrus fruits right there in your glasses, some citrus zest. There's a little bit of bitterness on the finish that's very refreshing. So really just such a lively, fresh, pure wine with like also a mineral line cutting through it, especially on the finish. Lovely precision. I think it's a fantastic wine, actually. And it's a great example of that fresher style that I was saying, but it isn't by any means simple, despite the fact that it's made in this lighter, fresher style. The second wine that I wanted to talk about is sort of one step up in terms of how old it is, as well as how much time it has seen in oak. It is the Bodegas Loli Casada. It is called La Cancilla, which means rooted in rock. It's also 100% Viura, like the previous wine. It's from Rioja Alavesa. This vineyard was planted in 1945, so the vines are a little bit old. It's a 3.5 hectare parcel in La Guardia. Interestingly, production is very, very limited. It's only 600 bottles, and they practice traditional sustainable viticultural practices here. The wine was fermented in French oak barrels with batonnage and some aging on fine lees, and then of course some aging in barrel. I think it spent 5 months in oak. So you can definitely taste the oak here compared to the previous one. It's a bit of spice, a little bit of toasted brioche, some vanilla, but also lots and lots and lots of fresh stone fruit, citrus fruit, and orchard fruit as well. A little bit more concentration than the previous wine. Lots of acid here too, though. I think it's a really balanced wine, really, really interesting. I think it's one of the best Viuras I've had, actually. So I'm very happy that I get to taste it with you today. I hope at least some of you get the chance to taste it at some point. Oh, and the finish is just really, it just lingers on the palate. And there's also a little bit of creaminess here and richness that the lees have imparted. that I really like, but I also like that there's so much acidity balancing it out and supporting the palate. Okay. So moving on to the last wine that I chose to spotlight today, it's the 2018 Real Agrado. It's their Las Planas Gran Reserva. So this is also 100% Viura like the other two, but this is from Rioja Oriental. It's from the slopes of Monte Yerga, which is a pretty high mountain in the region. So it's a high altitude vineyard exposed to cold northern winds, which have a cooling influence. You can see there's a bit of freshness in the wine. I already tasted it previously. I think that what's interesting about it is that it has been aged in oak for 30 months. Six of the barrels were American, the other half were French, fine grain with a medium and medium plus toast. So all of this aging and all of this time on lees has imparted this wine a lot of richness, a lot of texture. It's very, very creamy, almost buttery. And there's an intense concentrated flavor profile here. There's a bit of honey, some wood characteristics, some sandalwood, some cedar, there's spice, there's lots of vanilla, but there's also a core of dried peaches and apricots, also some fresh. It's not that old. I think it still has, it can still age a little bit more. So there's some fresh and some dried white fruits. This is, I would say, well, it's hard to say because I actually enjoyed all of the three wines in different ways, but this is probably the most intense, the most concentrated of all of the three wines. There's a sense of volume on the palate when it kind of fills your mouth. It feels almost like unctuous or oily, I would say. But then there's that acid backbone that cuts right through it, so that it doesn't ever feel languid or heavy on the palate. And I was saying before our seminar started that the finish was just because I tasted it right before. I always like to have a little glass of wine right before I start a presentation or a class. And this finish just lingered on my mouth almost halfway through the presentation. I was still tasting this wine. So it's an incredibly intense, concentrated wine with incredible, impressive length. So I think that's everything I wanted to mention about this wine. Great. Okay. Does anyone want to talk about the wines that they've been tasting?
No hands up. I'll share a little bit of what I poured for today. I poured the Bodega Santalba Reserva from 2016. It's aged 14 months in French and Russian oak. It's barrel fermented, batonnage. And before the um, presentation, I was asking Megha, this oxidative characteristic or style, is that common in aged Rioja whites? Because a lot of the time I'd pour it for customers and they kind of questioned, hey, is this wine still sound? And then I get them to taste it and I'm like, well, how lively is that acidity, right? And that's kind of what convinces them that it's a good quality wine and then it's not faulted or over the hill or oxidized. Is that true? Am I doing it right? I mean, ask a professional here. Ask an expert here, I guess. So, Megha.
Yeah, well, to me, I agree totally with you. That's why I kept mentioning the acidity because that richness of texture needs that acid backbone. But I also think one thing that's great about the best Rioja whites that are barrel aged and bottle aged is that they also have this rich core of fruit flavors. So it's not as if, you just have these oak flavors and there's no soul of fruit in there because there has to be this give and take between those two aspects, right? So even if it's an older wine and it's dried fruit, nevertheless, you have this rich fruit character balancing off like the yin and yang of all of that oak spice and that wood and so on. So I think the quality of the fruit really, really matters. You can only use the best quality fruit to make one of these, barrel aged, bottle aged wines. If you have something that the fruit are okay from younger vines, I would say go for that fresh, lighter style and, drink it when it's young and appreciate the freshness and the beauty that it has. But if you have high quality fruit from old vines, from a great site, then go for something like this. Clément, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, just sharing what I am drinking right now. It's from Bodega Ijalba. So this is the label, and this is made out of Maturana Blanca grape, which is a small portion of the white production, but it's very interesting grape. And the distinctive feature from the Viura is that there is a very velvety sensation in the mouth. The texture is very round, and it's almost thicker and it very rich in the mouth. In terms of notes, we have tropical fruits. It's a kind of refreshing wine, but with the velvety sensation in the mouth and the round sensation. Very interesting. Yeah, it's fermented in concrete vats, and only 10% it's oak age. So the oak is very little, and yeah. For those who are in Quebec, we can find this at the SAQ. It's a small production, but very interesting.
What vintage did you say that it was?
It's a young vintage. It's 2022.
Ah, interesting. I was going to say when you were talking to her about the color, I don't know if it's going to show in the camera, but this is that last wine, the 2018 Grand Reserva. You can really see, I mean, it is basically gold.
Yeah, it is.
It's quite, versus the first wine was, so pale compared to this. Did anyone else want to share what they're tasting? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Anyone in the crowd want to share? Oh, yeah, Matt.
I don't have a wine, but I have a question. We're talking about oak. I'm wondering your views about use of American oak versus French oak in whites. If you feel like it sort of adds a traditional feel with American oak, or it just adds a weird dill taste, or what's your views on that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think that it is really depends on what you like. I think there's room for every, style or preference when it comes to that. Traditionally, French oak is considered to be more delicate and imparting more light, delicate flavors of toasted brown spices, versus you have American oak giving more vanilla and, like you mentioned, dill and sandalwood, that sort of thing. It can sometimes express itself differently to different people. One of my colleagues often describes it as melted butter, which I've never heard before, but that's his marker for American oak. For me, it really is like dill. Which funnily enough, I don't actually like in real life, but in wine, I like it. So it's interesting. So it's a stylistic choice. I think American oak, I think, is less restrained. It's perhaps a little bit more expressive. It imparts more vivid flavors, I would say. But again, it's also a function of toast. I mean, level of toasting can have a huge impact on how much flavor is going to be transferred from the barrel to the wine, as well as how many times the barrel has been used. Given that you're working with white, you need to be, I think, a little bit more careful potentially, although I would argue you should be careful regardless of whether it's red or white wine that you're working with. But because white wines tend to be a little more delicate in flavor, I guess it's very, very important to make sure, to that earlier point I made about the balance between the fruit character and the oak characteristics. It's just important to make sure that you don't use aggressive oak flavors that will overwhelm the fruit. Also, I should note, you made a point about it being more traditional, and so that's something that can also add appeal. I think there is something unique about using American oak because not very many places in the world do it. So I think even using a little bit can add a unique character that is specific to Rioja. I mean, arguably, it's now, in a sense, it's a part of its unique identity that differentiates it from the rest of the world. And I think there are a lot of producers that do that. They do a combination of American and French oak. In fact, I think there's one producer, I wish I remembered the name off the top of my head. They actually make oak barrels with one stave American and one stave French. So they alternate the staves in shaping the barrel. So you get the best of both worlds, so to speak.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
If no one else has a question, I wanted to ask, do most people have wines today? Is there anybody who'd like to say if they're enjoying the wine that they're having? Is anyone here tasting an oak aged, slightly older Rioja white? That would be great. Was anyone able to find one?
Was it difficult for you guys to find a Rioja white in your market? Like a struggle, or you can find it easily?
There we have
Alex. Go ahead, Alex. Just unmute.
I'm
Thank
in
you.
Calgary, and we have access to some whites. I'm not tasting any right now, but I've listed the Muga white, for example, and we have quite a nice selection of whites as well. I've got a question regarding the Remeyuri. You've indicated there are 9 grape varieties, but the Remeyuri has a 10th, which is, I think, Viognier. So does that mean that if you want to, you could plant other grape varieties outside the 9 ones and use them in your wines? Or why does the Remeyuri has 10 as opposed to exceeding the limit there?
That is a very good question. I think that that it's been referred to as an illegal white, correct, Clément? Because
Yes.
technically it's in violation, but I think it's just such a absolutely extraordinary wine that you know, sometimes the rules are for to be broken in some contexts. Did you want to add anything to that, Clément?
Yes, I think in the first vintage there was like 10 different varieties, including Roussanne and Viognier, and it was an illegal wine regarding to the regulation from the Consejo Regulador, but it was tolerated, and mostly because it was fantastic. And some producer they play with the rules, and sometimes when the result it's nice and it doesn't hurt the competition or the rest of the producer, they are tolerated. And then we can mention that Telmo Rodriguez he labeled the village on some of his wines recently before the Vino de Municipio regulation was accepted. So he was kind of ahead of the regulation for the whites and for the Vino de Municipio, the villages wines. But that's not the only one. So yeah, sometimes you have to play with the rules a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, it also kind of is how styles evolve, right? Because if everybody follows the rules will never change. There has to be a push sometimes to change the rules or to try something different. Just like the fact that you have Tempranillo Blanco being one of the permitted varieties now, that wouldn't happen if you weren't to push for some change. I think at a certain point there was even a ban. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, Clément, but there was a ban on planting more white varieties for a period of time because there was so much Viura being planted. And then there was a push by the cooperatives to say, no, please don't do that. And so then it was the ban was lifted and white varieties were again permitted to be planted. So the rules do change. I think we have another question.
Daniel, please go ahead.
Yes,
And
Daniel Carroll from Quebec. I just wanted to mention that during the Best Sommelier of Canada competition in Halifax last fall, we had a wonderful seminar on Rioja whites, and I've been enjoying them greatly ever since. And in my community of customers and acquaintances, really promoting them, and the response has been very positive.
That's amazing. Could you share some of the producers that you're stocking or that you find that people are really enjoying?
Well, quite honestly, I'm customer driven. In other words, the events are pretty well dictated by the budgets that the customers are willing to put forward. So the list would probably be too long. But I think the real point that I wanted to make is that the seminar in Halifax last fall was an eye opener. And when I saw that today's event was on the calendar for interesting subjects in Canada, I made it a point to put my schedule aside and be here today to listen to what the group, the community is feeling about the subject. I really am interested in it.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Daniel. Any other questions or comments from the crowd?
Alex?
Alex again?
Yeah, I was wondering whether you could also share all the wines that we've discussed today in a follow-up email so we could have a record of those.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Okay, thanks.
I can also send along the tech sheets.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah, and maybe even put the
Amazing.
prices, at least the prices in Ontario.
That'd be amazing.
Right.
All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add some information. You know, the production almost disappeared by the end of the 20th century, but now is growing, but by very high numbers. And then the Rioja is actually the second most productive denomination de origen for white wines in Spain, just after Reda. So it means a lot. And I think by the popular customer demand is going to be growing for the next years.
And I think one of the strengths of Rioja is the diversity of varieties that are in the region, as opposed to other regions which tend to specialize in certain grape varieties. It's also interesting from a climate change perspective. I sort of hinted at that because I think I was kind of looking it up. I was wondering, well, why would white grape varieties be a solution or one way to combat climate change? And it's interesting because some of the reasons are really obvious, like just the fact that it's a lighter grape means it absorbs less heat. So there have been viticulturists who've measured the temperature of the internal temperature of grapes on a hot sunny day and found the red grapes are just actually hotter. So in that sense, it is sometimes useful to grow grape varieties that are lighter skinned. And also the issue of tannin ripeness is less of a sensitive issue with white wines because you're not keeping the juice in contact with the pips and the skin for as much time. Versus with red wines, it's so important to get that exact balance of preserving acidity, not letting sugar accumulate, but getting full ripeness in the tannins and the anthocyanins, etc. So it's kind of interesting that white grapes can be, in some ways, easier to grow in the face of climate change.
Looks like we have a question from the crowd here. Are there any regional dishes specific to Rioja that are served with Rioja Blanco?
That's very interesting. So I saw that they would serve a lot of seafood. In Logroño, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Logroño. Obviously, Clément, you've been. It is probably one of my favorite cities in the world now since I went. It has a lot of tapas bars, and the great thing about it, by the way, is that they'll have sometimes like 100 wines by the glass, which is such a privilege and quite shocking to me when I come from Canada. It's like so atypical to find that much choice. But I often found that they would suggest pairing it obviously with seafood. But I remember pairing a couple of oaked ones with, they do these croquetas with mushroom and cheese. And that was really delicious. They do a blue cheese one that I was actually, when I was tasting the last wine, the oak aged Grand Reserva, I think it would go really well with a blue cheese kind of dish. The trouble is that I don't eat meat. Clément, do you have any suggestions for pairing whites with meat?
Well, in terms of specific local dishes, I will say yes. The mushrooms, asparagus, local asparagus, even if it's difficult to pair, this is a local production that is popular and in the pairing. And also, the Rioja region is not too far from the Atlantic Ocean and the Basque Country coast. So a lot of seafood comes into La Rioja and all the tapas bar. So you can pair those whites with octopus, with shrimp, of course, a lot of different things. And there is a large production of local cheese where it can come from the Basque Country, País Vasco, Navarra, or La Rioja. So you have some choice.
Yeah.
And of course, vegetables. Yeah.
I was also wondering if Idiazabal might work with it. I paired it more with reds, but it might work with this, right? It's a Basque cheese, traditional Basque cheese. I don't know if it might work with this heavier white, I think.
how do you say the name of this
I must
cheese?
be pronouncing it wrong. Idiazabal, like
Idiazabal, yes. Or yeah, somebody suggests tortilla, and I approve this as well in the chat. Thank you, Marie-Hélène.
now I'm getting hungry.
Yeah.
Any
and
other
if there-
questions, comments from the crowd? No, looks like everyone's happy. Sorry, Clement.
Okay.
No, that's everything.
Were you about
Thank
to say
you.
something? I think I cut you off.
Yes, I was just about to say that the white ones pair very well with international food. It can be from Asian or Asiatic countries. So yeah, it's very easy to find a dish to pair with Rioja white, not only from the Spain and the region, but from all over the world.
Well, that's absolutely true. I think like if you have one of those fresher, like non oak aged viuras, they go really, really well with Indian food because that fresh fruit, that acid, it's really nice. That citrus zest, it can be really nice. As long as it's not too spicy, it can work really well because I eat a lot of Indian food. So, if no more questions, then I just
Yeah.
wanted to share very quickly. First of all, thanks to all these different sources and people that have contributed to the presentation. They're incredibly knowledgeable on Spain, on Rioja. So we appreciate their contributions. And then I just wanted to add a little bit about the Rioja Wine Academy. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great resource. I use it all the time. There's many different courses that you can take. They are free. And it's a really, there's videos to watch as well, there's photographs, and then there's lots of information there that you can learn. And it's at different levels, so you can choose what your level of expertise is on Rioja and then choose the right course for you. So I recommend you check it out. You just have to click on that URL and it'll take you right there. And finally, of course, I want to thank CAPS again. And Domer, thank you so much for managing this whole thing, for setting it all up, for moderating the discussion, and for contributing to it as well. And of course, Clément, thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity to focus on white Rioja. As I was saying, I think it's a category that's not getting the attention that it deserves, but that is very much changing. It's enjoying a renaissance of sorts. And I, for one, am very excited about it. And I'm really glad that we have people in the audience who are very, very excited about it. There's some comments, actually. Oh, just thank you. That's great. Yeah.
A lot of thank yous, a lot of positive feedback and comments from the presentation coming through. So thank you all.
Of course. Thank you so much.
We will send the slide deck to everyone registered or that came, and then the presentation will be on the ACSP YouTube channel as well, just so everyone can revisit it. And for those that didn't have a glass of wine or two in front of them, maybe they can re-watch the presentation and taste along another day. So
Yes, absolutely.
right on.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Domer and Megha.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.